Hello, and welcome to another Lighthouse Manna podcast. I'm Pastor Jeff Glenn, and it's my pleasure to take you through the Word each week. We've been going through Genesis. Last week, we saw in Genesis 17 Abram's name change and how he, as Abraham, reacted to the news of this promise, really, from the Lord that great nations would be made of his offspring. And so today in Genesis 18, we actually have two stories in this chapter, but they have the common theme of displaying God's faithfulness. And so today we'll actually see how Sarah responded to this promise that the nations would come from her offspring. And so chapter 18 opens with this visit to Abraham from three men. And men, it seems that they're messengers from the Lord, and it doesn't seem, it says so. And one of them, Abraham, actually calls Lord. And so this is an indication of what we see here is a pre-incarnate Jesus, a theophany or a Christophacy. You know what I'm saying. So this encounter is very interesting because it also points to this Lord being this divine figure that Abraham sees. He immediately sets out running around preparing a meal for him, including this young calf and the butter and the goat's milk and all of that. And so we see Abram, he reverenced this Lord and showed great urgency to go and serve him and his companions. And so even urging them, hey, don't pass by me until you can stop and I can serve you. And so as they talked with the Lord promised to return to them according to the time of life, in reference to Sarah, meaning when Sarah would conceive and bear a son. And so Sarah's in the tent and she overhears this conversation, and then it says here that she laughed within herself. So this isn't an outward laugh, and somehow the Lord hears it. Well, not somehow, he's omniscient, he knows everything. And so Sarah sees this, hears this conversation, and kind of in a questioning way is laughing within herself that she had heard this from the Lord. And so the Lord calls her on this, and to make matters worse, she lies to the Lord, saying, I wasn't laughing. And of course the Lord knows what's going on inside of us. And so she was busted. And then because of that, the Lord's response to her is in verse 14, is anything too hard for the Lord? And that's a great question. I mean, no matter how rhetorical it may be, we need to ask ourselves this question constantly about the Lord and his promises. Like is anything too hard? Absolutely not. The answer is no. Nothing is too hard for the Lord. Yet sometimes we think that the fulfillment of God's promises are unlikely considering our circumstances, as if our circumstances are where we find ourselves is somehow a hindrance to God. And then other times we just flat out refuse to believe. But what we see here is Sarah laughing because of the circumstances that she finds herself in. She finds herself as an old woman, way past the time of natural childbearing years. And so she somehow thinks that's somehow a hindrance for the Lord. And the Lord says, not so. I mean, nothing's too hard for me, in a sense. And so, listen, God's faithfulness is not driven by our circumstances, where we find ourselves in life physically. That's outside of God's consideration. God is God, and he'll do what he wants to do. So in verse 19, we see the transition into the second story with this promise or this purpose statement that comes out of the Lord's promise for Abraham. And he says here that, for I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household. He's speaking of Abraham, that they may keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. And so this idea that Abraham would pass on through his family, that he hadn't yet had, this righteousness and justice is the purpose of the Lord bringing this promise to him and bringing him children, so that this promise and covenant would perpetuate. And that is why the Lord is doing this. And then we see this pivot right here to the Lord heading to Sodom and Gomorrah. And in verse 21, we have the Lord here telling us what he's about to do. I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. And so Abraham knows exactly what this means. It's also, in a sense, a rhetorical question. The Lord full well knows the sin and wickedness going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. So by him stating that he'll go down and acknowledge the outcry, this means that he will judge Sodom and Gomorrah. And in fact, God's holiness demands that he would judge Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness. In the 1800s, Jonathan Edwards wrote a sermon that he entitled Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. And the gist of this sermon was that God is angry at sin. He will pour out his wrath on sin. And so that's the bad news of the gospel, right? We know that gospel means good news, but without this bad news of the impending judgment and subsequent wrath of God, then the good news kind of falls flat if God does not pour out his wrath upon sin. So then in our century, in our day and age, R.C. Sproul wrote a sermon titled God in the Hands of Angry Sinners. And in it, he describes how times have changed regarding the stomach of the Big C church to receive this kind of fire and brimstone preaching, as if love and grace are God's only attributes. So he goes on to write that God is all too often referred to today, as he quotes here, God is altogether sweet to me. My God is a God of love, but a God of love who has no wrath is no God. He is an idol of our own making as much as if we carved him out of stone. So this idea that somehow we can remove the nature and character of God to pour out his wrath upon sin and only view God in terms of his mercy and in his love creates an idol that we are warned against creating. And so Abraham both knew the God of love and mercy and the God of wrath. He's one and the same. And he's faithful to both, but not at the expense of the other, right? So his love and mercy don't diminish because of his wrath. In fact, they complete each other. And so Abraham knew that Sodom and Gomorrah were to receive God's judgment and wrath. And so whether it was strictly for Lot and his family's sake or not, it certainly was within Abraham's understanding that of God's perfect justice, right? This character of God to execute perfect justice, right? So as he's asking if God would destroy a city with 50 righteous men in it, this is where we begin that conversation where Abraham is engaging with the Lord of supposing if there were 50 men, and then supposing if there were 45, and reducing that on and down. So not only did Abraham have his theology dialed in correctly regarding God's character and nature, he also had a correct understanding of the character and nature of man in this conversation here with this reduced amount each time until they come to the end here. So in his plea or conversation with the Lord, he continually reduces the number. And so he was saying, would suppose there were 5 less than 50 righteous, and then he would go on to say, suppose there would be 45 or 40, and then what about 30, and so on. Each time reducing it. This displays Abraham's correct understanding of man. That is in alignment with what the psalmist would later write in Psalm 14:3. They have all turned aside. They have altogether become corrupt. There is no one who does good, no, not one. Even in Romans, Paul would say, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And Jesus himself in Luke 18:19 said, no one is good except God alone. And so armed with this correct theology, Abraham knew that God would fulfill his mandate to execute justice on Sodom and Gomorrah. And so that's an encouragement for us also. It's also a caution, right? So that whether it's a promise, as he promised to Sarah, or an obligation to pour out his wrath, or his mercy, God will be faithful to fulfill all of those and still maintain his nature and character. And so until next week, stay encouraged and stay in the Word.